Ahoy! Today we're talking about Cyberpunk 2077's launch. More specifically, we're looking into some of the statistics surrounding that, because you may have heard a lot of things about how things are going without really bringing you the data along with it, and I'd like to change that. Very quick disclaimer, the gameplay is all spoiler free, I made sure of that, so don't worry about that if you haven't played it yet. So we're going to look into some statistics as well as some articles and some other reports that have been made, but there are some things that need to be said before we get into that. One thing is that, yes, there are obvious issues on the console side of things. The launch on console did not go well, the performance on consoles was poor, and the game has been pulled from the PS4 store at this point. So that is something that should not happen, and that is a very big problem for them, even though the company behind Cyberpunk, CD Projekt Red, has stated that they're working on fixing this as quickly as possible. After my video about the recent hotfix, I had some comments saying that the performance for them had drastically improved on PS4 specifically. I cannot confirm that as I don't have a PS4, so I can't speak for that. Hopefully, over the upcoming month, we will see further improvements to that. Along with that, the launch in itself is also something that one could easily criticize, especially with the massive amount of crunch that the developers had to experience. While this is something that is very common in the gaming industry, especially because it's so easy to get new employees, I don't think it should be necessary and it should be encouraged at all. So those are most certainly things that I think one should be critical of, all numbers aside. And now let's have a look at the numbers themselves. Today I found this tweet from Benji Sales, who quoted the article from CD Projekt Red, stating that Cyberpunk had sold over 13 million units as of December 20th. So roughly, very roughly in the first week and a little bit more. This number already includes refunds, meaning they are subtracted from that, so this is the number of sales after refunds. Benji wrote, "This would rank as potentially the biggest RPG launch of all time, with Fallout 4 having shipped with 12 million copies on day one." Now, I'm not entirely sure if that's comparable, since one is just day one and the second and third day usually see a lot of sales as well. But unfortunately, we don't have the numbers for an entire week, but we'll look into some other numbers, don't worry. Here is the article from CD Projekt Red themselves, which just further specifies that this includes all the sales and subtracts all the refunds, as well as the refunds that are requested via email right now, so that it's an accurate number. This report doesn't seem to be aimed at the gamer side. This wasn't posted by CD Projekt Red on their Twitter or something. It's probably more for the shareholders who may be upset at the moment. So let's look at some other games just to have an understanding of what these numbers mean. Keep in mind that in cases where the numbers are not published, they can be wildly inconsistent. I, for example, found some other numbers for Fallout 4 claiming that it actually only sold around 5 million copies in the first week, so it's very vague. I found this graph here, which claimed that as of March 2020, Fallout 4 had sold 13,500,000 copies. Unfortunately, you can't get a source on Statista without buying an account, so I could not verify that. But what's interesting here is that we see Fallout 76 at 2.46 million, which should roughly add up, and putting that in perspective next to Cyberpunk is pretty interesting. So less than a fifth of the sales, really, for a game that was at the time still highly anticipated, considering it was the next Fallout. Maybe also puts in perspective a little bit which game really failed harder. And then we have some other games. Game Rant made a list with the 10 highest selling video games of the decade. So some of them are interesting here for us because they're also single player RPG style games or similar to Cyberpunk. Red Dead Redemption, for example, sold roughly 26 million overall over quite some time. It didn't launch with this massive peak as well. The Elder Scrolls Skyrim sold 30 million between all its different platform releases and re-releases and whatnot. So yeah, there's a lot coming together there and not just one version that was released once. And then GTA 5 far ahead of the competition with 115 million. Now keep in mind, GTA 5 was free at some point on Epic Games, but that was after this article came out, so this would have been before that, so these were actually copies that people paid for. But interestingly enough, on the Guinness World Record website, we can find out that in the first 24 hours, GTA 5 only sold 11 million copies. So it's actually a lot closer to Cyberpunk, even though over the first week it may have sold a fair bit more still. And GTA 4 actually sold almost the same, with 11 million units. The Witcher 3 over its lifetime had sold 50 million copies by the middle of last year. So what we can see is that Cyberpunk can really hold its own here in sales, even though there was a significant portion of refunds, which many of these other games probably didn't have to the same degree. Obviously, these numbers are not comparable to what some games pulled later, but there are a few things to keep in mind here. First of all, most of the other games you're looking at here are established IPs. It's the 5th installment, the 3rd installment, and so on, of game series that are already established, while Cyberpunk is a completely new IP that is only established as a board game really, which is not really significant for PC game sales to that scale. Also, Cyberpunk so far doesn't have DLC yet, there weren't any sales yet that the other games may have had. We don't really have a PS5 version and an Xbox Series X version yet. While you can play the last gen version on the new gen consoles, there will be dedicated versions later down the road once they're optimized, so that'll probably bring in a few more sales as well. And we also don't have any modding for the game yet, which is often a driving factor for sales, especially looking at Skyrim. And then technically there's also the planned multiplayer, which is something that pushed GTA 5 a lot, but that's a different conversation for a different day. Now, at this point you may be wondering, if the game sold relatively well, why would the shareholders be unhappy? Wasn't there a lawsuit that was happening? Well, I did some digging on that because a lot of articles reported about this, and I did some digging on the source. So IGN, for example, posted about this, and I think most other websites just copied it from IGN. CG Projekt Red could face class action lawsuit over misrepresentation. And I figured, let's have a look at the source. And that's what I did. And the source is some Polish forum post. And I wanted to see what this post contains, so I just used my crafty Google Translate skills. And I found the translation for this email, which is very basic. It's supposedly an attorney and a CDPR investor who is very upset with how things are going and with the suspension of the sale on PS4. The post actually doesn't mention threatening a lawsuit, but rather that his team is analyzing the grounds for bringing a class action lawsuit together on the grounds of misrepresentation in order to obtain financial benefits. And I gotta question if that's actually that easy to do. I feel like that wouldn't be that easy, but that is not even the most questionable part here. The email address that you're supposed to contact ends with ad4biz with ZZZ.com. I thought that sounded really weird and really unprofessional, and I was like, what business is called 4biz? A beehive? So I looked it up, and surprise, surprise, that website doesn't exist. And if you search for 4biz on Google, then you basically just find articles linking back to this very post. In other words, there's a pretty good chance this was just some internet troll and this lawsuit never even existed, and all the articles just copied it from each other and made it look legitimate. Now, if you've looked further, you may rightfully ask, but then what about the stocks? They were dropping, right? You get articles like this one, buggy Cyberpunk shaves billions off of company stock. You have others saying that they dropped by 30 or 40%. And those articles are technically not wrong, but it's a lot about framing, especially when the drops are since earlier this month. And this is where I'd play Nickelback's Look at This Graph, if I wouldn't get a copyright strike, because this is the graph you may have seen. A dramatic drop in value from 300 something Polish zloty to 200 something, 250-ish. Yeah, looks bad. Look at this. This is the curve over a month. Ironically, it looks even worse now, because there have been multiple drop-offs, and if you look very closely, the first drop-offs were before the game was even released. The game was released on the 10th, and these drops started on the 4th. Strange, why could that be? Well, let's look at the even bigger picture and see how the graph really looks if we look over a long time span, being 5 years in this case. What you can see here is that the stock has massively increased since 2016, and with 2020 we kind of reached the point where it dropped for you know what reason, and then went up heavily after that, and then just dropped again now after the release, and is now back to its very early 2020 state. So really not that dramatic overall. paints a very different picture, and that's how you should be looking at most stocks anyways. Reddit user Saxon Turner posted that they did a fair bit of research a few days ago because they were considering to invest, and they said that the stock was likely too high anyways, and the value was predicted to fall even with a good launch. A lot of people were just buying up stocks with the intention of selling around launch to maximize their profits. And inevitably, if everyone sells their stock, then the price will drop. Another user replied that CDPR was even valued above Bethesda, which is a giant in the industry. So really, it is no surprise that the stock had to crash at least a little bit. Now, of course, these numbers could look better if Cyberpunk launched completely bug-free and perfect on every platform, but that simply wasn't the case. If we look at the Steam charts, we can see that the game is most certainly not at its peak anymore, but that's also completely unsurprising, since almost every single player will have its highest numbers in the first days, and we're also getting close to Christmas, so a lot of people are kind of busy with that stuff for a bit. It is, however, still very interesting to see where Cyberpunk can go from here, if they can hold enough players, if CD Projekt Red's stock will recover in the process, and so on. And I think that heavily hinges on how well they do with the upcoming fixes, with performance improvements, especially for consoles, but also in general, and with the launch on the new consoles. So there's still quite a bit on the horizon, as well as, of course, the DLC. The downside of this whole thing, in my opinion, is that the numbers that we have here don't necessarily signal to CD Projekt Red's shareholders that the game should have been released later. It would be very nice if they get a clear message that they rushed it out and that rushing games out is not good, even if you get the Christmas market or something like that through it, and rather finish a project first and release it then for an optimal release. I am very sure that the devs at CD Projekt Red are aware of that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the shareholders would care, and I don't know if the development here will change their opinion on that. We're going to be talking about Cyberpunk more very soon because I'm working on a review. So if you'd like to see that, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell if you're new to the channel so that you get notified of that. Other than that, I hope to see you for the next one soon. Duke Sloth, out.